class struggle in the Soviet countryside, a struggle involving 120 million people. But can we blame the poor and the oppressed, in their struggle for a life worth living, in their struggle to ensure their children would not be starving illiterates, for not being sufficiently civilized or showing enough mercy in their courts? Can't one point the finger at people who for hundreds of years had no access to the advances made by civilization for not being civilized? And tell us, when was the gulag exploiter civilized or merciful in his dealings with poor peasants during the years and years of endless exploitation? Our second example, that of the counter-revolutionaries convicted in the 1936–38 trials which followed the purges of party, army and state apparatus, has its roots in the history of the revolutionary movement in Russia. Millions of people participated in the victorious struggle against the Tsar and the Russian bourgeoisie, and many of these joined the Russian Communist Party. Among all these people there were, unfortunately, some who entered the party for reasons other than fighting for the proletariat and for socialism. But the class struggle was such that often there was neither the time nor the opportunity to put new party militants to the test. Even militants from other parties who called themselves socialists and who had fought the Bolshevik Party were admitted to the Communist Party. The number of these new activists were given important positions in the Bolshevik Party, the state and the armed forces, depending on their individual ability to conduct class struggle. These were very difficult times for the young Soviet state, and the great shortage of cadres, or even of people who could read, forced the party to make few demands as regards the quality of new activists and cadres. Because of these problems, there arose in time a contradiction which split the party into two camps. On the one hand, those who wanted to press forward in the struggle to build a socialist society, and on the other hand those who thought that the conditions were not yet right for building socialism and who promoted social democracy. The origin of these ideas lay in Trotsky, who had joined the party in July 1917. Trotsky was able over time to secure the support of some of the best-known Bolsheviks. This opposition united against the original Bolshevik plan provided one of the policy options which were the subject of a vote on December 27, 1927. Before this vote was taken, there had been a great party debate going on over many years and the result left nobody in any doubt. Of the 725,000 votes cast, the opposition secured 6,000, i.e., less than 1% of party activists supported the united opposition. As a consequence of the vote, and once the opposition started working for a policy opposed to that of the party, the Central Committee of the Communist Party decided to expel from the party the principal leaders of the united opposition. The central opposition figure, Trotsky, was expelled from the Soviet Union. But the story of this opposition did not end there. Zinoviev, Kamenev and Zhirinovkin afterwards made self-criticisms, as did several leading Trotskyists, such as Byadkovy, Radike, Preobrashinsky and Smirnov. All of them were once again accepted into the party as activists and took up once more their party and state posts. In time it became clear that the self-criticisms made by the opposition had not been genuine, since the oppositionist leaders were united on the side of the counter-revolution every time that class struggle sharpened in the Soviet Union. The majority of the oppositionists were expelled and readmitted another couple of times before the situation clarified itself completely in 1937–38. The murder in December 1934 of Kirov, the chairman of the Leningrad Party and one of the most important people in the Central Committee, sparked off the investigation that was to lead to the discovery of a secret organization engaged in preparing a conspiracy to take over the leadership of the party and the government of the country by means of violence. The political struggle that they had lost in 1927 they now hoped to win by means of organized violence against the state. Their main weapons were industrial sabotage, terrorism and corruption. Trotsky, the main inspiration for the opposition, directed their activities from abroad. Industrial sabotage caused terrible losses to the Soviet state, at enormous cost. For example, important machines were damaged beyond possibility of repair, and there was an enormous fall in production in mines and factories. One of the people who in 1934 described the problem was the American engineer John Littlepage, one of the foreign specialists contracted to work in the Soviet Union. Littlepage spent 10 years working in the Soviet mining industry, from 1927 to 37, mainly in gold mines. In his book In Search of Soviet Gold, he writes, "I never took any interest in the subtleties of political maneuvering in Russia so long as I could avoid them. But I had to study what was happening in Soviet industry in order to do my work. And I am firmly convinced that Stalin and his collaborators took a long time to discover that discontented revolutionary communists were his worst enemies." Littlepage also wrote that his personal experience confirmed the official statement to the effect that a great conspiracy directed from abroad was using major industrial sabotage as part of its plans to force the government to fall. In 1931 Littlepage had already felt obliged to take note of this, while working in the copper and bronze mines of the Urals and Kazakhstan. The mines were part of a large copper-bronze complex under the overall direction of Byadakov, the People's Vice Commissar for Heavy Industry. The mines were in a catastrophic state as far as production and the well-being of their workers was concerned. Littlepage reached the conclusion that there was organized sabotage going on which came from the top management of the copper-bronze complex. Littlepage's book also tells us from where the Trotskyite opposition obtained the money that was necessary to pay for this counter-revolutionary activity. Many members of the secret opposition used their positions to approve the purchase of machines from certain factories abroad. The products approved were of much lower quality than those the Soviet government actually paid for. The foreign producers gave Trotsky's organization the surplus from such transactions. as a result of which Trotsky and his co-conspirators in the Soviet Union continued to order from these manufacturers. This procedure was observed by Little Page in Berlin in the spring of 1931 when buying industrial lifts for mines. The Soviet delegation was headed by Piatkovy, with Little Page as the specialist in charge of verifying the quality of the lifts and of approving the purchase. Little Page discovered a fraud involving low-quality lifts, useless for Soviet purposes. But when he informed Piatkovy and the other members of the Soviet delegation of this fact, he met with a cold reception, as if they wanted to overlook these facts and insist he should approve the purchase of the lifts. Little Page would not do so. At the time he thought that what was happening involved personal corruption and that the members of the delegation had been bribed by the lift manufacturers. But after Piatkovy, in the 1937 trial, confessed his links with the Trotskyist opposition, Little Page was driven to the conclusion that what he had witnessed in Berlin was much more than corruption at a personal level. The money involved was intended to pay for the activities of the secret opposition in the Soviet Union, activities which included sabotage, terrorism, bribery and propaganda. Zinoviev, Kamenev, Piatkovy, Radek, Tomsky, Bukharin and others much loved by the Western bourgeois press used the positions entrusted to them by the Soviet people and party to steal money from the state, in order to enable enemies of socialism to use that money for the purposes of sabotage and, in their fight against socialist society in the Soviet Union, theft, sabotage and corruption are serious crimes in themselves, but the opposition's activities went much further. The counter-revolutionary conspiracy was being prepared aimed at taking over state power by means of a coup in which the whole Soviet leadership would be eliminated, starting with the assassination of the most important members of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. The military side of the coup would be carried out by a group of generals headed by Marshal Tukhachevsky. According to Isaac Deutscher, himself a Trotskyite, who wrote several books against Stalin and the Soviet Union, the coup was to have been initiated by a military operation against the Kremlin and the most important troops in the big cities, such as Moscow and Leningrad. The conspiracy was, according to Deutscher, headed by Tukhachevsky together with Gamartnik, the head of the army political commissariat, General Kier, the commander of Leningrad, General Borovich, the commander of the Moscow Military Academy, and General Primakov, a cavalry commander. Marshal Tukhachevsky had been an officer in the former Tsarist army who, after the revolution, went over to the Red Army. In 1930 nearly 10% of officers, close to 4,500, were former Tsarist officers. Many of them never abandoned their bourgeois outlook and were just waiting for an opportunity to fight for it. This opportunity arose when the opposition was preparing its coup. The Bolsheviks were strong, but the civilian and military conspirators endeavored to muster strong friends. According to Bukharin's confession in his public trial in 1938, an agreement was reached between the Trotskyite opposition and Nazi Germany, in which large territories, including the Ukraine, would be ceded to Nazi Germany following the counter-revolutionary coup in the Soviet Union. This was the price demanded by Nazi Germany for its promise of support for the counter-revolutionaries. Bukharin had been informed about this agreement by Radike, who had received an order from Trotsky about the matter. All these conspirators who had been chosen for high positions to lead, administer and defend socialist society were in reality working to destroy socialism. Above all, it is necessary to remember that all this was happening in the 1930s, when the Nazi danger was growing all the time and the Nazi armies were setting Europe alight and were preparing to invade the Soviet Union. The conspirators were sentenced to death as traitors after a public trial. Those found guilty of sabotage, terrorism, corruption, attempted murder and who had wanted to hand over part of the country to the Nazis could expect nothing else. To call them innocent victims is completely mistaken. It is interesting to see how Western propaganda, via Robert Conquest, has lied about the purges of the Red Army. Conquest says in his book The Great Error that in 1937 there were 70,000 officers and political commissars in the Red Army and that 50% of them, i.e., 15,000 officers and 20,000 commissars, were arrested by the political police and were either executed or imprisoned for life in labor camps. In this allegation of Conquest's, as in his whole book, there is not one word of truth. The historian Roger Rees, in his work The Red Army and the Great Purges, gives the facts which show the real significance of the 1937-38 purges for the Army. The number of people in the leadership of the Red Army and Air Force, i.e., officers and political commissars, was 144,300 in 1937, increasing to 282,300 by 1939. During the 1937-38 purges, 34,300 officers and political commissars were expelled for political reasons. By May 1940, however, 11,596 had already been rehabilitated and restored to their posts. This meant that during the 1937-38 purges, 22,705 officers and political commissars were dismissed, close to 13,000 Army officers, 4,700 Air Force officers and 5,000 political commissars, which amounts to 7.7% of all officers and commissars, not 50% as Conquest alleges. Of this 7.7%, some were convicted as traitors, but the great majority of them, it would appear from historical material available, simply returned to civilian life. One last question. Were the 1937-38 trials fair to the accused? Let us examine, for example, the trial of Bukharin, the highest party functionary to work for the secret opposition. According to the American ambassador in Moscow at the time, a well-known lawyer called Joseph Davies, who attended the whole trial, Bukharin was permitted to speak freely throughout the trial and put forward his case without impediment of any kind. Joseph Davies wrote to Washington that during the trial it was proved that the accused were guilty of the crimes of which they were charged, and that the general opinion among diplomats attending the trial was that the existence of a very serious conspiracy had been proved. The discussion of the Soviet penal system during Stalin's time, on which thousands of lying articles and books have been written, and hundreds of films have been made conveying false impressions, leads to important lessons. The facts prove yet again that the stories published about socialism in the bourgeois press are mostly false. The right wing can, through the press, radio and TV that it dominates, cause confusion, distort the truth, and cause very many people to believe lies to be the truth. This is especially true when it comes to historical questions. Any news stories from the right should be assumed to be false unless the contrary can be proved. This cautious approach is justified. The fact is that even knowing about the Russian research reports, the right is continuing to reproduce the lies taught for the last 50 years, even though they have now been completely exposed. The right continues its historical heritage. A lie repeated over and over again ends up being accepted as true. After the Russian research reports were published in the West, the number of books began to appear in different countries aimed solely at calling into question the Russian research and enabling the old lies to be brought to public attention as new truths. These are well-presented books, stuffed from cover to cover with lies about communism and socialism. The right-wing lies are repeated in order to fight today's communists. They are repeated so that workers will find no alternative to capitalism and neoliberalism. They are part of the dirty war against communists who alone have an alternative to offer for the future, i.e., socialist society. This is the reason for the appearance of all these new books containing old lies. All this places an obligation on everybody with a socialist world outlook on history. We must take on the responsibility of working to turn communist newspapers into authentic newspapers of the working classes to combat bourgeois lies. This is without doubt an important mission in today's class struggle, which in the near future will arise again with renewed force.